In the unforgiving crucible of the 1870s, Arizona desert, a line is drawn in the sand, not by men, but by blood, prejudice, and survival. This is the saga of Ethaniel Laughty, a young cowboy, barely a man whose world is as vast and as empty as the landscape before him. And it's the story of Dasan, a warrior and heir to the Chiricahua Apache, left for dead by his own. Their paths, destined to collide in violence, instead intertwine in a desperate gamble for life. What unfolds is a journey that will challenge every belief, forge an unbreakable bond, and send shockwaves through the foundations of the Wild West. The sun was a merciless hammer pounding the Arizona territory into a shimmering, heat-distorted anvil. For 19-year-old Ethaniel Laughty, the landscape was a familiar adversary. He'd been born under its unforgiving gaze, his skin tanned the color of worn leather, his eyes narrowed to a permanent squint from years of scanning the horizon. He was riding the southern line of the Circle S Ranch, a sprawling, hard-won piece of land owned by the formidable Jedediah Stone, a man whose heart was as calloused as his hands. Ethan wasn't a Stone, but he might as well have been. Orphaned at 10 when his parents' homestead was swallowed by the desert's insatiable appetite for failure, he was taken in by Jedediah. He wasn't treated as a son, but as another hand, another tool to be worked until it was worn. He learned to ride before he could properly read, to shoot before he could spell his own name, and to expect nothing from the world but what he could take with his own 2 hands. His horse, a tough dun mare named Dust Devil, picked its way through the cracked earth, its shod hooves crunching on the gravel. The air was thick with the scent of creosote and dust. It was a day like any other, a monotonous patrol for stray cattle or signs of trouble. Trouble in this part of the world usually had a name, Apache, the Chiricahua specifically. To men like Jedediah, they were specters, a constant unseen threat that justified every loaded rifle and every suspicious glance. The stories told around the campfire were of brutal raids of stolen livestock and murdered settlers. Ethan had absorbed these tales like the dry ground, soaked up a rare rain, the fear and hatred becoming a part of his very marrow. It was the buzzards that drew his attention first, a dark vortex of them circling lazily in the brassy sky. Not an uncommon sight, but this was different. They were concentrated, their flight patterns tight and purposeful. A knot of unease tightened in Ethan's gut. He nudged Dust Devil forward, his hand instinctively resting on the worn stock of the Winchester rifle in his saddle scabbard. He found the scene in a narrow, sun-scorched arroyo. The stench hit him first, the coppery metallic smell of fresh blood, so thick it was almost a taste. The ground was churned and stained, a testament to a recent violent struggle. 2 bodies lay twisted on the rocks. Both were Apache warriors, their dark hair matted with blood, their bodies bristling with arrows. But not Cowboy's arrows. These were Apache arrows. The fletching, the sinew wrappings, it was the work of their own people. Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs. This was an internal affair, a tribal dispute. The smart thing to do was to turn around, ride back to the ranch, and report what he'd seen. Jedediah's primary rule was to never, ever get involved in Apache business. It was a hornet's nest you didn't poke. He was about to do just that when a low groan cut through the oppressive silence. Ethan froze his eyes, scanning the bloody tableau. He saw nothing. He must have imagined it, a trick of the heat. He was turning Dust Devil when he heard it again, weaker this time, a pained exhalation. His gaze fell upon a third figure, half hidden beneath a rocky overhang, almost completely obscured by shadow. Slowly, cautiously, Ethan dismounted his rifle, now in his hands, its cold weight a small comfort. He crept forward, every nerve ending screaming at him to flee. The figure was an Apache younger than the others, perhaps Ethan's own age. He was slumped against the rock wall, his buckskin tunic shredded and soaked in a dark, spreading stain. An arrow identical to the ones in the other two bodies protruded from his side, just below the ribs. His face, streaked with dirt and blood, was contorted in a mask of pain. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow and ragged. Ethan stood over him, the rifle aimed, his finger hovering over the trigger. This was the enemy. The phantom raider from the campfire stories. The reason he slept with a pistol under his pillow. Every instinct, every lesson Jedediah had ever beaten into him screamed at him to finish it. It would be mercy in a way. The desert would claim him soon enough. A single bullet would be quicker, cleaner. He raised the rifle, the metal sight aligning with the wounded man's chest. The Apache's eyelids fluttered. For a fleeting moment, his dark eyes opened unfocused and glazed with pain. But they met Ethan's. There was no hatred in that gaze, no defiance. Only a raw, desperate plea for life, a look so profoundly human it shattered the monstrous image Ethan had held in his mind. In that instant, the Apache wasn't a faceless savage. He was a young man, no older than himself, bleeding out in the dirt. A war raged within Ethan, a conflict more violent than the one that had just occurred in the arroyo. The voice of Jedediah, gravelly and stern, echoed in his memory. The only good Apache is a dead Apache. But then another voice, one he hadn't heard in years. His mother's soft and gentle whispered a forgotten scripture. Thou shalt not stand by the blood of thy neighbor. Who was his neighbor? The man who gave him a roof over his head, but treated him like livestock. Or the stranger at his feet, whose only crime, as far as Ethan could see, was being on the losing end of a fight. His finger eased off the trigger. He lowered the rifle, with a curse that was half prayer, half frustration. Ethan knelt beside the wounded man. He didn't know why he was doing it. It was a fool's errand, a betrayal of everything he'd been taught. But as he looked at the young Apache, he saw not an enemy, but a reflection of his own fragile existence in this brutal land. He saw another soul fighting and failing to survive. He had to get the arrow out. He knew enough about wounds to know that leaving it in was a death sentence. Gritting his teeth, he took hold of the shaft. The Apache's eyes shot open again this time with a flash of alarm. But he was too weak to resist. Hold still. Ethan grunted the words, feeling foreign and useless. This is gonna hurt like hell. With a swift, brutal jerk, he pulled the arrow free. A choked scream tore from the Apache's throat, and a fresh torrent of blood pulsed from the wound. The man convulsed and then went limp, his head lolling to the side. For a terrifying moment, Ethan thought he'd killed him. He pressed his fingers to the man's neck. A faint, thready pulse fluttered against his fingertips. Still alive, barely. Ethan tore a strip from his own shirt and pressed it hard against the wound, trying to staunch the bleeding. He needed water. He needed shelter. He needed to get them both out of this sun-drenched coffin of an arroyo. He looked at his horse, then back at the unconscious Apache. He couldn't just leave him here to be picked apart by the buzzards. The decision, as reckless and insane as it was, had already been made. He was going to save him. With a grunt of exertion, Ethan hauled the wounded man onto his shoulders. The Apache was surprisingly light, all lean muscle and bone, but it was still a dead weight. Staggering under the load, Ethan carried him to Dust Devil. The mare shied away, her eyes wide with fear at the scent of blood. "Easy, girl, easy." Ethan soothed his voice, strained. Somehow he managed to heave the Apache across the saddle, draping him face down like a sack of grain. The man didn't stir. Ethan swung himself up behind him, taking the reins. He cast one last look at the dead warriors in the arroyo, then at the circling buzzards who seemed to be descending lower as if impatient. He turned Dust Devil north, away from the Circle S, away from the life he knew. He was heading towards the Dragoon Mountains, a jagged spine of rock that offered the only real shelter for miles. He had no plan, no supplies to speak of, and a dying Apache on his horse. He was riding into the heart of the unknown, guided by a single, inexplicable act of mercy. He didn't know the name of the man he carried. He didn't know the arrow that pierced his side was an assassin's meant to rewrite the future of the Chiricahua people. He only knew that he had made a choice, and that choice had set him on a path from which there could be no return. The desert stretched before him, vast and indifferent, and for the first time in his life, Ethaniel Laughty was truly, utterly alone. The journey was a fever dream. The sun beat down, turning the world into a white-hot haze. Ethan's own thirst was a physical pain, a rasping file in his throat. He could only imagine what the man slumped over his saddle was enduring. Every so often, a low moan would escape the Apache's lips, a sound that twisted Ethan's insides into a knot of guilt and fear. He'd made a colossal mistake. This was madness. Jedediah would kill him if he found out. Not just for helping an Apache, but for deserting his post. And what was his plan? Find a shady spot. Give the man a sip of water from his nearly empty canteen. And then what? Wait for him to die. Or worse, wait for him to wake up and try to kill him. The Dragoon. Mountains, once a distant promise on the horizon, grew steadily closer, their granite peaks offering a refuge from the relentless sun. Ethan found a small hidden canyon, a fissure in the rock face choked with mesquite and palo verde trees. A thin trickle of water, green with algae, seeped from a rock spring, creating a small muddy pool. It wasn't much, but it was life. He carefully lowered the Apache from the saddle. The man was lighter than he looked, and his body was frighteningly hot to the touch. The fever had taken hold. Ethan laid him down in the shade, using his saddle blanket as a makeshift pillow. The makeshift bandage on his side was soaked through with blood. The wound was angry and inflamed the skin around it, a purplish red. Infection was setting in. Using his kerchief, Ethan soaked up some of the precious water and gently cleaned the wound as best he could. Then he dribbled a few drops onto the man's cracked lips. The Apache's tongue, dry and swollen, emerged to lick at the moisture. His eyes flickered open, no longer glazed with pain, but sharp now and aware, and filled with a deep, bottomless mistrust. He stared at Ethan, his dark eyes taking in the white skin, the worn cowboy hat, the rifle leaning against a nearby rock. His hand, slow and weak, moved towards the empty sheath at his belt, where a knife would normally be. "Easy there," Ethan said, his voice low and steady, holding up his empty hands. "I'm not going to hurt you." The Apache said nothing. His gaze was intense, searching, trying to decipher the impossible situation he found himself in. A white man had saved him. It made no sense. It was a violation of the natural order of things, a world where the only interaction between their two peoples was violence. "Water," Ethan said, holding out the canteen. The man stared at it, then back at Ethan. He was too weak to sit up. Gingerly, Ethan cradled his head and brought the canteen to his lips. The Apache drank slowly at first, then greedily, the cool water spilling down his chin. When he was done, he slumped back. His breathing still labored, but a flicker of life returning to his eyes. They spent the rest of the day in silence. Ethan tended to Dust Devil, then sat with his back against a rock, his rifle across his lap, watching the Apache. The man watched him back. It was a silent, tense standoff, a fragile truce born of necessity. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the sky, casting long shadows across the canyon, the Apache spoke. His voice was a dry, hoarse whisper. Why the single word hung in the air between them? Ethan looked away towards the darkening plains. He didn't have an answer. Not one that would make sense anyway. "I don't know," he said, the admission tasting like ash in his mouth. "You'd have been buzzard food." The Apache considered this his expression unreadable. "They will hunt me." Who? Ethan asked. The man's gaze flickered towards the south, back towards the arroyo. "My cousin, Kyle. He wants to be chief. My father. He is Coochis." Ethan's blood ran cold. Coochis. The name was a legend, a myth whispered in fear around every settler's campfire. The great chief of the Chiricahua Apache, a brilliant and ruthless war leader who had held the U.S. Army at bay for years. This wounded man, this boy no older than himself, was his son. It was impossible. It was also terrifyingly plausible. The arrows, the ambush, it wasn't a random skirmish. It was an assassination, an attempted coup. He had just saved the heir to the most powerful Apache tribe in the territory. The weight of his actions crashed down on Ethan with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't just harboring a wounded Apache. He was harboring royalty. He was now a player in a deadly political game he couldn't possibly comprehend. Kyle, whoever he was, wouldn't stop hunting. And when he found them, he wouldn't care that one of his targets was a white cowboy. "What's your name?" Ethan asked, his own voice barely a whisper. Dasan the Apache replied. Dasan, the name felt solid real. It gave a face to the legend. Ethan looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not the son of a fearsome chief, but a young man betrayed and left to die his birthright, a death sentence. "I'm Ethan." Dasan nodded slowly. "Ethan." He repeated the name, sounding strange on his tongue. He coughed a racking, painful sound that shook his whole body. The fever was getting worse. His skin was slick with sweat despite the cooling night air. Ethan knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that Dasan wouldn't survive another day without proper medicine. The poultices and herbal remedies his mother had used were a world away. The only place to get real medicine, a doctor, was a small, dusty trading post called Agua Prieta, a good 2 days' ride from here. It was a haven for the desperate and the damned miners, trappers, army deserters and outlaws. It was the last place on earth you'd want to take the son of Coochis. But it was also their only hope. "We need to get you to a doctor," Ethan said, the decision forming, even as he spoke the words. Dasan's eyes widened in alarm. "No. No white man medicine. They will kill me. They'll kill you if you're the son of Coochis," Ethan countered. "But if you're just some half-breed I found in the desert, they might just patch you up for a price." He was thinking fast, a desperate plan taking shape. "We'll say you're my partner. We were prospecting, got jumped by bandits. It's a thin story, but it's better than the truth." Dasan was swung. For a long time, his gaze fixed on the stars that were beginning to prick the velvet blackness of the sky. He was trapped. To stay here meant a slow, agonizing death. To go with this strange white boy, this Inder who had inexplicably saved him, was a gamble that could end with a rope or a bullet. The spirits have shown me a strange path. Dasan whispered more to himself than to Ethan. He looked at Ethan, his eyes clear and lucid for a moment, the fever receding just enough for a decision to be made. I will go with you, Ethan, but if you betray me, I will find a way to take you with me to the Black Hills. Ethan nodded, accepting the grim promise. Fair enough. He knew he was walking a razor's edge. On one side was Jedediah Stone and the world he had known, a world that would see him as a traitor. On the other was Kael and his assassins, who would see him as an obstacle. And in the middle was this trading post, a nest of vipers, where a single wrong word could get them both killed. As he redressed Dasan's wound with the last of his clean cloth, he felt a profound shift in his own world. The simple lines of good and evil, white and Apache friend and foe had been blurred into an incomprehensible, dangerous grey. He was no longer just a ranch hand. He was a protector, a conspirator, a renegade. He was bound to the fate of the young chief at his side. He had saved Dasan's life in the arroyo, but now, under the vast, silent gaze of the desert stars, he realized he was just beginning to fight for it. Agua Prieta was less a town and more a festering wound on the face of the desert. It consisted of a single dusty street lined with a handful of adobe buildings, a saloon, a general store, a blacksmith, and a dilapidated structure with a faded sign that read, Dr. Alistair Finch, M.D. All maladies cured. The air hung thick with the smell of cheap whiskey, unwashed bodies, and despair. Ethan rode in slowly, every muscle tensed. Dasan, delirious with fever, was slumped against him, his face hidden by the wide brim of a spare hat Ethan had given him. He'd wrapped one of his own worn-out shirts around Dasan's torso, hiding the buckskin and the bloody bandage. To any casual observer, they were just two down-on-their-luck prospectors, another pair of dreamers broken by the desert. But Ethan felt the weight of every stare. The hard-bitten men lounging on the saloon porch, the suspicious eyes of the store owner, peering out from behind a grimy window. They were all potential threats. He dismounted in front of the doctor's office, the building leaning as if exhausted by the heat. He half-carried, half-dragged Dasan inside. The interior was even more grim than the outside. It was a single cluttered room that smelled of stale herbs and carbolic acid. Shelves overflowed with dusty bottles and sinister-looking medical instruments. In the center of it all sat Dr. Alistair Finch, a man who looked as if he had been assembled from spare parts. He was gaunt and stooped with a stained coat spectacles perched on the end of his nose and hands that trembled with a tremor he tried to conceal by constantly wringing them. His eyes, magnified by the thick lenses, were watery, but sharp. "What have we here?" Dr. Finch asked, his voice a dry rustle. "Another fool who tried to shake hands with a rattlesnake." "Bandits," Ethan said, sticking to his story. He helped Dasan into a rickety chair. "Jumped us near the Chiricahwas. My partner, he's hurt bad." The doctor shuffled over his eyes, narrowing as he took in Dasan's fever-flushed face and shallow breathing. He peeled back the shirt, his expression souring at the sight of the angry, infected wound. "Partner, you say?" He mused, glancing at Dasan's high cheekbones, his dark hair, the unmistakable cast of his features. He has the look of the local gentry about him. Ethan's stomach clenched. His mother was Mexican. He lied, the words coming out faster than he intended. From south of the border. Dr. Finch let out a humorless chuckle. Of course she was. And I'm the Queen of England. He poked a finger near the wound, causing Dasan to hiss in pain. This is an arrow wound, not a bullet, and it's festering badly. He'll be dead by morning if that poison isn't dealt with. Can you help him? Ethan asked, his voice pleading. The doctor looked from the dying Apache to the desperate cowboy. He saw the rifle Ethan carried, the pistol at his hip. But more than that, he saw the look in the boy's eyes of fierce, protective loyalty that was dangerously out of place in a world where survival was a solitary pursuit. Alistair Finch was a cynic, a man who had seen the worst of humanity, but he was also a doctor. The instinct to heal, buried under layers of alcohol and disappointment, still flickered within him. It will cost you, he said flatly. Everything you have. Ethan didn't hesitate. He emptied his pockets onto the dusty table, a few coins, a worn-out knife, the small pouch of gold dust he'd been saving for a year. It wasn't much, but it was his entire world. Dr. Finch eyed the meager payment, then sighed. Get him on the table. The next few hours were a living hell. The doctor worked with a surprising swiftness, his trembling hands becoming steady as he cleaned and debrided the wound, cutting away the poisoned flesh. He forced a foul-smelling concoction of herbs and whiskey down Dasan's throat and packed the wound with a pungent green-colored salve. Dasan thrashed and cried out his delirium, fueling his struggles, forcing Ethan to hold him down, his own heart aching with every pained gasp. When it was over, Dasan lay still, his breathing evening out the fire of the fever, seemingly banked for now. He was alive. He's strong, Dr. Finch admitted, wiping his hands on an already filthy rag. Most would be dead. Now get him out of my sight. I don't want him here when the sun comes up. Too many questions. Ethan nodded, exhausted but grateful. He settled into a chair in the corner, his rifle across his lap, to wait. He must have dozed off, because the next thing he knew, a sound from the street jolted him awake. It was the sound of horses, several of them riding into town with a confident, arrogant swagger. A cold dread washed over him. He peered through the grimy window. 3 men were dismounting in front of the saloon. 2 were Apaches, their faces hard and cruel, their eyes scanning the street with a predator's intensity. The third was a white man, tall and broad-shouldered, with a handlebar moustache and a pair of silver-inlaid pistols strapped to his hips. He moved with the easy lethality of a hired gun. Ethan's blood turned to ice. It had to be them. Kael's men. They had tracked them. He looked back at Dasan, who was still lost in a feverish sleep. They were trapped. To run would be to draw attention. To stay would be to wait for death. The saloon doors swung open, and the 3 men disappeared inside. Ethan's mind raced. He needed a plan, a way out. He looked around the doctor's cluttered office, his eyes landing on a stack of old wanted posters. An idea desperate and dangerous began to form. He shook Dr. Finch awake. I need your help, he whispered urgently. Those men, they're the ones who jumped us. They'll kill us if they find us. The doctor's eyes widened with fear as he peered out the window. What do you want from me? He hissed. I need a distraction, Ethan said, and a back door. He explained his plan quickly, his words tumbling over each other. It was a long shot, a fool's hope, but it was the only one they had. The doctor, motivated by a potent combination of self-preservation and a flicker of something that might have been courage, reluctantly agreed. A few minutes later, the doctor stumbled out of his office and scurried across the street to the saloon, clutching a wanted poster in his hand. Ethan watched, his heart pounding, as Finch approached the hired gun. He saw them talking, the doctor gesticulating wildly, pointing at the poster, and then towards the east, away from the town. The hired gun seemed skeptical at first, but then his interest was piqued. Greed, Ethan was betting, was a powerful motivator. While the hired gun was distracted, his two Apache companions grew restless. They emerged from the saloon, their eyes once again sweeping the street. Their gaze lingered on the doctor's office, on Dust Devil tied up outside. One of them pointed, and they started to walk across the street, their hands on their knives. It was now or never. Ethan grabbed a heavy glass bottle from a shelf. "Sorry about this, Doc," he muttered. With a grunt, he smashed the bottle against the wall, creating a loud crash. He then half-lifted, half-dragged the barely conscious Dasan towards the back of the building, where a small, rickety door led out to a narrow alley. The two Apaches broke into a run, kicking open the front door of the doctor's office, just as Ethan and Dasan slipped out the back. Ethan could hear their shouts of anger and frustration. He didn't wait to hear more. He hoisted Dasan onto his shoulders and ran his lungs, burning his legs, screaming in protest. He stumbled down the alley, expecting a bullet in his back at any moment. He reached the end of the street and risked a glance back. The hired gun was now running out of the saloon, shouting at his men. They had bought the doctor's story, but the crash had given them away. They knew their prey was close. Ethan didn't have his horse. He was on foot in the open, carrying a wounded man. They were as good as dead. Just as despair began to take hold, a figure emerged from the shadows of the blacksmith's forge. It was Dr. Finch. He was holding the reins of two horses. "I figured you might need a faster way out of town," the doctor said, a wry, shaky smile on his face. "I have a brother in Tucson. Tell him Alistair still owes him for that poker game in '68. Now go. And for God's sake, try not to get killed." Ethan, stunned by the old man's unexpected bravery, could only nod. He managed to get Dasan onto one of the horses, then swung himself onto the other. "Thank you," he said the words, feeling inadequate. "Don't thank me," Finch replied, already melting back into the shadows. "Just prove to me that not every soul in this God-forsaken territory is rotten to the core." With a kick of his heels, Ethan spurred the horses into a gallop, heading west into the gathering darkness. The sounds of pursuit from Agua Prieta faded behind them. They had escaped, but they were far from safe. They were riding stolen horses with no supplies, a wounded man and assassins on their trail. Ethan looked over at Dasan, who was now conscious, his eyes clear and fixed on Ethan with a new, startling intensity. The mistrust was gone, replaced by something else, something that looked almost like respect. They had survived the Devil's Crossroads, but the desert was vast, and their enemies were relentless. The fragile alliance between the Cowboy and the Apache Heir had been forged in blood and desperation. Now it would be tested by fire. For 2 days they rode west, pushing the stolen horses to their limits. The desert gave way to a broken, hilly country that offered more cover, but also more places for an ambush. Ethan's instincts were on a razor's edge. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a pursuing hoofbeat. Dasan was recovering with a speed that was almost unnatural. The doctor's medicine, combined with his own formidable constitution, was working a miracle. The fever was gone, and though he was still weak, the color was returning to his face. He was able to sit his horse on his own, his back straight, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings with a warrior's practiced vigilance. The silence between them was different now. It was no longer the tense, mistrustful silence of their first days together. It was a shared silence, a communion of two people who had faced death together and survived. They spoke little, but when they did, it was with a newfound ease. Dasan, freed from the delirium of fever, was intelligent and observant, his English better than Ethan had realized. He asked Ethan about his life, about the ranch, about the world of the white man. Ethan, in turn, found himself asking about the Apache way of life, about their beliefs, their customs. The monstrous caricature from the campfire stories was being replaced by the reality of the young man riding beside him. Kael. He was my father's sister's son, Dasan explained one evening as they shared a meager meal of jerky Ethan had managed to buy in Agua Prieta. He is ambitious. He thinks my father's peace talk with the white eyes is a weakness. He wants war. He wants to return to the old ways. Peace talk, Ethan asked, surprised. He'd only ever heard of Coochis as a warmonger. My father is old. Dasan said, his voice laced with a sadness that seemed too heavy for his young shoulders. He has seen too many of our people die. He knows we cannot fight the white man forever. The cannons, the endless soldiers, they are like the stars. You can fight them, but you cannot defeat them all. He sought a treaty, a piece of land that would be ours forever, and Kael doesn't want that. Dasan shook his head. He wants to be the next Geronimo. He preys on the anger of the young warriors, fills their heads with promises of glory. He thinks that by killing me, he can force my father's hand or inherit his place if my father's heart breaks. Ethan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. He was caught in the middle of a civil war, a battle for the very soul of the Apache nation. His simple act of mercy had thrust him into the center of history. On the third day, their luck ran out. As they crested a low rise, Ethan saw it, a familiar brand on a familiar steer. The Circle S. They had ridden in a wide loop, and in their desperate flight had ended up on the far western edge of Jedediah Stone's vast ranch. It was the last place on earth he wanted to be. He was about to turn back when he saw the riders. A posse of them, at least a dozen, fanned out in a search pattern, and at their head, on a big black gelding, was Jedediah himself. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. They had been seen. Jedediah and two other men broke off from the group and galloped towards them, their rifles drawn. Ethan's heart sank. This was it. The end of the line. Hold on, Ethan said to Dasan under his breath. Let me do the talking. And for God's sake, try to look half Mexican. Jedediah pulled his horse to a skidding halt a few yards away, his face a thundercloud of rage. His cold blue eyes swept over Ethan, then lingered on Dasan with undisguised contempt. Laughty, he snarled the name, an epithet. I ought to shoot you where you sit. Deserting your post, stealing my property. He gestured with his rifle towards the stolen horse Ethan was riding. It was by a stroke of cosmic bad luck, a horse from the Circle S stables that had been stolen weeks ago. It's not what it looks like. Mr. Stone. Ethan began, his voice shaky. It looks like you've thrown in with the savages. Another ranch hand. A burly man named Cole spat out his rifle, aimed squarely at Dasan's chest. He's not Apache, Ethan lied, his voice gaining a desperate strength. He's a prospector. We were partners. We got ambushed. Jedediah laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. A prospector, boy. You think I'm a fool? I can smell an Apache a mile away. I know who he is. We found the bodies in the arroyo. We followed the tracks. You've been harboring the devil himself. The blood drained from Ethan's face. They knew. He's the son of Coochis. Jedediah said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. There's a bounty on his head from the army. A big one. Enough to set a man up for life. His eyes glinted with avarice. You should have killed him when you had the chance, boy. Would have been the smartest thing you've ever done. Now you're just a loose end. The unspoken threat hung heavy in the air. Jedediah wasn't just going to take Dasan. He was going to kill Ethan to cover his tracks, to make it look like he had been the one to heroically capture the Apache prince. Ethan looked at Dasan. The young chief's face was a mask of calm, but his hand had crept to the hilt of the knife Ethan had given him. He would not be taken alive. In that moment, something inside Ethan snapped. He was tired of being Jedediah's tool, his whipping boy. He was tired of the hatred, the prejudice, the casual cruelty that men like Stone used to justify their greed. He had seen a different world in his time with Dasan, a world of honor and loyalty, a world where a man's worth wasn't measured by the color of his skin. He made his choice. He slowly raised his hands as if in surrender. All right, Jedediah, he said, his voice calm. You win. He's all yours. Jedediah smiled a predator's smile. Wise decision, boy. He nodded to Cole. Take him. As Cole moved his horse forward, Ethan acted. In a single fluid motion, he dropped his hands, drew his pistol and fired. Not at Jedediah. Not at Cole. He fired at the ground right in front of Jedediah's horse. The big black gelding screamed and reared, throwing the surprised Jedediah from the saddle. At the same instant, Dasan flung his knife, a silver blur that buried itself in the shoulder of the third rider, causing him to cry out and drop his rifle. Go, Ethan yelled, firing another shot that sent Cole's horse bolting. He spurred his own mount, grabbing the reins of Dasan's horse and pulling him along. They galloped away, leaving a scene of chaos behind them. Jedediah was on the ground, cursing his men in disarray. They had bought themselves a few precious minutes, but now they had a new enemy, one more relentless and more personal than Kael's assassins. They were being hunted by the ghost of Ethan's own past. Jedediah Stone would not rest until he had his bounty and his revenge. The Circle S was no longer a home. It was a hunting ground, and they were the prey. They rode hard, not looking back, the sound of gunfire and enraged shouts fading behind them. Ethan's past was a pillar of smoke on the horizon. His future was an unknown territory, a path he now shared completely with the Apache prince at his side. They were two fugitives bound by an impossible friendship, riding against a world that wanted them both dead. Their flight from the Circle S posse was a desperate, frantic scramble. They pushed their horses through treacherous canyons and across barren mesas, doubling back on their tracks, using every trick Dasan knew to throw their pursuers off the scent. For days they lived on the edge, sleeping in short, nervous bursts and eating whatever they could find. A handful of berries, a tough, stringy rabbit snared by Dasan. The shared danger forged their bond into something stronger than steel. They were no longer just a cowboy and an Apache. They were brothers. Their differences burned away by the fires of their ordeal. Ethan learned to see the world through Dasan's eyes, to read the signs in the bent grass, to understand the language of the birds, to feel the rhythm of the land. Dasan in turn began to understand the strange contradictions of Ethan's world, a world that could produce men like Jedediah Stone, but also men like Dr. Finch and like Ethan himself. Their destination was Coochis' stronghold, a secret, impregnable fortress hidden deep in the Dragoon Mountains. It was their only hope of safety. But to get there, they had to cross a wide, exposed plain, a killing ground, where they would be easily spotted by Jedediah's relentless trackers. They were making a cold camp one night, huddled behind a cluster of rocks, when Dasan suddenly went still, his head cocked, listening. "What is it?" Ethan whispered, reaching for his rifle. "Horses," Dasan said, his voice low. "Two of them. Coming slow." They scrambled into a defensive position, their weapons ready. A few minutes later, two figures emerged from the darkness. They were Apaches, but they didn't look like Kael's warriors. They were older, their faces etched with the lines of hardship and wisdom. They stopped when they saw Ethan and Dasan, their hands raised in a sign of peace. One of the men spoke, his voice deep and resonant. "We are of the people. We followed the signs of the hunted. We seek the one called Dasan." Dasan stepped out from behind the rocks, his shoulders back, his expression regal. "I am Dasan," he said in his own language. The two warriors' eyes widened, and they slid from their horses, bowing their heads in a sign of profound respect. They were loyalists sent by Coochis himself to search for his missing son. The news of the ambush had reached the stronghold, and the tribe was in turmoil. Hope, bright and overwhelming, surged through Ethan. They were saved. The warriors, whose names were Chato and Nache, led them on a secret path through the mountains, a trail so narrow and treacherous that Ethan was sure his horse would plummet to its death at any moment. They traveled for another day, climbing higher and higher into the granite peaks until they arrived at a place that took Ethan's breath away. It was a hidden valley, a green oasis surrounded by towering cliffs of red rock. Waterfalls cascaded down the rock faces, feeding a clear, rushing stream. Wickups, the traditional Apache dwellings, were scattered amongst the trees. It was a place of peace and beauty, a sanctuary that felt a world away from the harsh desert below. But the welcome they received was not what Ethan had expected. As they rode into the village, people emerged from their homes, their faces a mixture of joy and suspicion. They cheered for Dasan. Their lost prince returned, but they stared at Ethan with open hostility. He was an Inda, a white eye, the enemy. His presence here was a sacrilege. They were taken to a large wicker up in the center of the village. Inside, seated on a pile of furs, was a man whose presence filled the entire space. He was old, his face a magnificent ruin of wrinkles and scars, but his eyes were black and piercing, burning with an intelligence and power that was almost terrifying. It was Coochis. Dasan rushed to his father, and the two embraced a rare show of emotion that spoke volumes of their love and respect for one another. Then Coochis' burning gaze turned to Ethan. "My son tells me you saved his life." The chief said, his English slow and deliberate, each word carrying immense weight. "He would have done the same for me," Ethan replied, his voice steady, despite the hammering of his heart. Coochis studied him for a long moment. "You are the first of your kind to stand in this place as a friend. Many have tried to find it. All have failed." He paused. "My son's life is a debt I can never repay. You are welcome in my home. You will be safe here." But safety was a complicated thing. While Coochis had accepted him, many others had not. A warrior with a cruel, scarred face and a palpable aura of menace stepped forward. It was Kael. He had returned to the stronghold, feigning ignorance of the ambush, pretending to mourn his cousin. His eyes bored into Ethan with pure, unadulterated hatred. "A white man in our sacred place," Kael sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "He is a spy, a liar. He led the White Eyes to our doorstep. He is the reason Jedediah Stone now knows our weakness." He pointed an accusing finger at Dasan. "And you bring this snake into our midst. You are weak like your father. Your heart has been softened by their poison." A murmur of agreement went through the crowd of warriors gathered at the entrance. The tribe was divided. Many of the younger men, swayed by Kael's promises of war and glory, saw Ethan's presence as a taint and Dasan's friendship with him as a betrayal of their people. "Ethan is my brother," Dasan declared, his voice ringing with conviction as he stood beside Ethan. "He has proven his honor." Kael speaks with a forked tongue. "It was his arrows we found in the bodies of my guards. It was his assassins who left me for dead." The accusation hung in the air, electric and deadly. Kael's hand went to his knife. "You lie." "Then prove it," Coochis said, his voice cutting through the tension like a razor. "We will have a trial, not of words but of skill, a challenge. Kael, you will face the White Eye, to the death." A shocked silence fell over the wick-up. Ethan's blood ran cold. A trial by combat. Against Kael, a seasoned and ruthless Apache warrior. He was a decent shot with a rifle, but up close with a knife. He wouldn't stand a chance. "No," Dasan said, stepping forward. "The quarrel is with me. I will fight him." "No, you will not," Coochis said, his voice firm. "You are not yet healed, and this is not just about your honor. It is about his." He looked at Ethan. "Kael says you are a snake. The people must see what is in your heart. Will you fight?" Ethan was trapped. To refuse would be to prove his cowardice, to dishonor both himself and Dasan. To accept was almost certain death. He looked at Dasan, saw the fear and desperation in his friend's eyes. He looked at Kael, saw the triumphant, murderous gleam in his. And he looked at Coochis, whose expression was unreadable, ancient, and wise. He was no longer just a cowboy from the Circle S. He was a symbol. His actions here in this sacred place would have consequences that rippled far beyond his own life. With a deep breath, he met Coochis' gaze. "I will fight, Ethan," said his voice, clear and strong. The die was cast. In the heart of the Apache sanctuary, the orphan cowboy from the white man's world would face the would-be chief in a battle for his life, his honor, and the future of a nation. The fragile peace was about to be shattered, and the sanctuary of scars would bear witness to one final bloody conflict. The arena, a natural amphitheater at the base of the cliffs, pulsed with a tense silence. The entire tribe had gathered to watch. In the center, Kael waited, a predator stripped to the waist, his long knife catching the sun. He moved with a brutal grace, his eyes locking onto Ethan with undisguised malice. Ethan, feeling clumsy and outmatched, clutched his own knife, its familiar weight offering little comfort against a seasoned warrior. He was a ranch hand, not a killer. He glanced at Dasan, who stood beside his father, his face a mask of anguish. Coochis' expression was unreadable, the old chief's decision to allow this duel, a heavy, unchangeable stone cast into a pool. This was more than a fight. It was a judgment. Kyle lunged without ceremony, his blade slicing the air where Ethan's heart had been a moment before. The next few minutes were a desperate dance of survival. Ethan was purely on the defensive, dodging and weaving his speed, his only advantage against Kyle's superior skill and strength. The warrior was toying with him, landing small cuts, a nick on the arm, a gash on the cheek, drawing out the kill, savoring the fear in the white man's eyes. Ethan's lungs burned. He was tiring, and Kyle saw it, a cruel smile spreading across his face as he moved in for the final blow. As Kyle lunged with a powerful overhand stab, Ethan remembered Dasan's words from a cold night on the trail. Let his rage be his undoing. A charging bull is blind. Instead of retreating, Ethan ducked under the blow, stepping inside Kyle's guard. In that split second, he slammed the pommel of his knife into Kyle's throat. The warrior staggered back, gagging his eyes wide with disbelief at the brawler's move. Before Kyle could recover, Ethan kicked his knee hard. A sickening crunch echoed in the silent arena, and Kyle collapsed, his knife skittering into the dust. Ethan stood over him, knife at his throat, chest heaving. He had won. He could end it. He could kill the man who had tried to murder his friend. He looked into Kyle's eyes and saw not a proud warrior, but a man consumed by pathetic fear. The voice of Jedediah Stone, a ghost from a life he no longer knew, whispered in his mind, "The only good Apache is a dead Apache." He raised the knife. But then his eyes found Dasan's. His friend was shaking his head, a silent, desperate plea. He looked at Coochis, whose stoic face held a flicker of what looked like approval. Ethan's arm trembled, the desire for vengeance warring with the man he had become. He lowered the knife. "He is beaten," Ethan declared, his voice ringing with newfound authority. "Let him live with his shame." He turned his back on the defeated warrior and walked away. A murmur of respect rippled through the crowd. He hadn't just won. He had shown mercy, a strength greater than any skill with a blade. Later, Coochis summoned them. Kyle and his few followers were banished, sent into the desert in disgrace. The tribe was united. "You have a warrior's heart, Ithaniel Laughty," the chief said, his voice resonating with respect. "But your path lies elsewhere. You walk between two worlds." He described a hidden valley to the north. "The land is good. You can build a new life there. No one will bother you. I will see to it." It was a gift beyond price, a new beginning, free from the ghosts of his past. When the day came for Ethan to leave, Dasan walked with him to the edge of the sanctuary. Dressed in fine buckskin, with a strong horse and full saddlebags, Ethan was a different man from the boy who'd stumbled into the arroyo. "I will not forget this." My brother, Dasan, set his hand on Ethan's shoulder. "I was just returning." "A favor," Ethan replied. "You taught me how to see. And you taught me that courage is not bound by the color of a man's skin," Dasan said. "My father is old. Soon there will be a new chief of the Chiricahua, a chief who has a white-eyed brother." The promise hung in the air between them, a bridge across their two worlds. With a final shared look, Ethan swung onto his horse. He turned north towards a future he had earned not with a gun, but with a single act of mercy. He was Ithaniel Laughty, the man who walked between worlds, the cowboy who had carried an Apache chief, and in doing so had found himself. The story of Ithaniel Laughty and Dasan is more than just a tale of the Old West. It's a timeless testament to the power of human connection to transcend prejudice and hatred. It reminds us that our choices, even the small, seemingly insignificant ones, can have profound consequences, shaping not only our own destinies, but the course of history itself. Their journey through the desert was a crucible that forged an unbreakable bond and planted the seeds of a peace that would one day bloom. If this story of courage, sacrifice, and unlikely friendship moved you, please give this video a thumbs up and share it with someone who appreciates epic historical dramas. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next journey into the untold stories that shaped our world. Thank you for watching.